The telemarketer's voice was shaking as he read from his script, but when the man on the other end of the line responded in that unmistakable Welsh accent, David Martinez nearly dropped the phone. It was Christmas Eve, 2003, and David was making his final desperate calls to meet his monthly quota when he realized he was talking to Anthony Hopkins. What started as a routine sales pitch was about to become the conversation that saved a life. David had been sitting in the cramped Orange County call center for 12 hours straight, surrounded by the fluorescent buzz of overhead lights and the constant murmur of dozens of other telemarketers working through their lists. It was 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and while most of the world was preparing for morning celebrations, David was facing the harsh reality that he was 17 calls short of keeping his job. He'd been selling magazine subscriptions for 6 months since losing his construction work, and the commission-based pay barely covered his rent in a studio apartment he shared with 2 other men. His ex-wife had recently stopped letting him see his 8-year-old daughter until he could prove financial stability, and the weight of that loss was crushing him more each day. The number on David's screen showed a Malibu area code, another wealthy household that would probably hang up before he finished his opening line. But desperate times called for persistent dialing. When a deep, measured voice answered simply, "Hello," David launched into his practiced pitch about discounted magazine subscriptions for the holidays. "Good evening, sir. I hope you're having a wonderful Christmas Eve. My name is David, and I'm calling about some special holiday offers that might interest you for the coming year." There was a pause. Then that voice, cultured, precise, unmistakably familiar, responded with unexpected politeness. "Well, David, I appreciate the call, though it's quite late. What magazines are we discussing?" David's heart began to race. He'd watched The Silence of the Lambs dozens of times, had seen The Remains of the Day in theaters, and that voice was unmistakable. But this couldn't be real. Famous people had unlisted numbers, personal assistants, barriers to prevent exactly this kind of call. Yet, as the conversation continued, the man displayed a patience and curiosity that seemed genuine, asking thoughtful questions about the magazine offerings, making David feel heard rather than dismissed. What David didn't know was that Anthony Hopkins had been having trouble sleeping lately. At 65, the Oscar-winning actor had achieved everything he'd dreamed of, and more, but success hadn't quieted certain voices in his head. Christmas Eve had always been complicated for him, a mix of gratitude for his sobriety journey that had begun over 28 years earlier, and melancholy for relationships and opportunities that his drinking had cost him in his younger years. He'd been sitting in his Malibu home, reading, when the phone rang. On any other night, he might have let the machine answer, but something made him pick up. "You know, David," Hopkins said after listening to the magazine pitch, "you sound tired. How long have you been working today?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely concerned, that David found himself answering honestly instead of deflecting back to sales talk. "Since noon, sir. I'm trying to make my numbers before the month ends." On Christmas Eve? That's dedication. There was warmth in Hopkins's voice, not condescension. "Tell me, do you enjoy the work?" David felt something crack inside his chest. Nobody had asked him that question in months. His supervisor cared only about call volumes and conversion rates. His ex-wife asked only about money. His roommates barely acknowledged his existence. But this stranger, this person who might actually be Anthony Hopkins, was asking about his life like it mattered. "Honestly, sir, no, I don't. But I'm trying to get back on my feet after some rough times, and it's what I can get right now." Hopkins was quiet for a moment. In that silence, he recognized something he'd heard in his own voice decades earlier. The particular exhaustion that comes not just from working hard, but from believing you don't deserve better. It was a tone he remembered from his drinking days, when shame colored everything and hope felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. "David," Hopkins said gently, "forgive me for asking, but are you all right? You sound like you're carrying quite a weight." That's when David began to cry. Not the quiet, professional tears he'd learned to hide during difficult calls, but deep, gasping sobs that came from a place he'd been trying to keep locked away. Through his tears, the words started pouring out. About losing his construction job when his back injury made lifting impossible. About the divorce and the custody battle and feeling like a failure as a father. about the studio apartment and the two roommates who resented his presence, about the magazine sales job that barely paid enough to survive, let alone rebuild his life. "I'm sorry," David managed between sobs. "I'm so sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this. You probably think I'm crazy." "I don't think you're crazy at all," Hopkins said, his voice steady and calm. "I think you're human, and I think you're in pain. How long since you've talked to someone about what you're going through?" David realized he couldn't remember. Months, maybe longer. The few friends he'd had before the divorce had gradually stopped calling. His family lived across the country and thought his problems were his own fault. The counselor his ex-wife had insisted he see during their marriage had been expensive and ultimately hadn't prevented their relationship from falling apart anyway. What happened next would change both their Christmas Eves forever. Instead of politely ending the call or offering generic encouragement, Anthony Hopkins made a decision that revealed the man behind the famous roles. He settled deeper into his chair and said words that David would remember for the rest of his life. "David, I want you to know that you've reached someone who cares about what happens to you, and if you're willing to talk, I'm willing to listen, for as long as you need." For the next 3 hours, until nearly 3 a.m. on Christmas morning, Anthony Hopkins stayed on that phone. He listened as David talked about his daughter, about feeling like he'd failed everyone who'd ever believed in him, about the growing feeling that maybe everyone would be better off without him. Hopkins shared stories from his own life, not the glamorous Hollywood parts, but the dark years when alcohol had convinced him he was worthless, when he'd hurt people he loved, when sobriety had seemed impossible. "I remember thinking that recovery was for other people," Hopkins told David, "people stronger than me, people more deserving than me. But the truth is, David, recovery, whether it's from addiction or divorce or job loss or whatever life has thrown at you, it's not about being worthy. It's about being willing to accept help when it's offered." David found himself talking about feelings he'd never put into words before. The shame of calling his daughter from the call center parking lot because he didn't want his roommates to overhear. The fear that he was becoming the kind of man his own father had been, absent, unreliable, always struggling. The growing darkness that whispered that everyone's problems would be solved if he just disappeared. Hopkins recognized that darkness. "David, have you been thinking about hurting yourself?" The question was asked so gently, so without judgment, that David found himself nodding even though Hopkins couldn't see him. "Sometimes. Not seriously, I don't think. But sometimes I wonder if it would be easier." "It wouldn't be easier for your daughter," Hopkins said quietly. "I know it feels like she'd be better off without you, but losing a parent, even an imperfect one, creates a wound that never fully heals. Your little girl needs her father to keep fighting, even when fighting feels impossible." Something in Hopkins's voice suggested he was speaking from personal experience, and David felt a small shift in his chest, not hope exactly, but a loosening of the tight despair that had been suffocating him for months. As their conversation continued through the night, Hopkins did something remarkable. He didn't just listen, he began making plans. He asked about David's skills beyond construction, his interests, his dreams before life had beaten them down. When David mentioned he'd always wanted to learn woodworking but couldn't afford classes, Hopkins asked for his address. When David admitted he hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days because he was saving money for his daughter's Christmas present, Hopkins asked for the name of a nearby restaurant. "David, I'm going to ask you to do something for me," Hopkins said as the first hint of Christmas morning light began to show through David's apartment window. "I want you to promise me you'll answer the phone tomorrow if I call. Can you do that?" David promised, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed the call would come. But it did. Christmas afternoon, Hopkins called to check on David, to see how he was feeling, to continue conversations they'd started in the dark hours of that night. And then he called again the next day, and the next. For weeks, these calls became a lifeline for David, not charity or pity, but genuine connection with someone who understood that recovery was a daily choice, that healing happened slowly, that everyone deserved a second chance. What David didn't learn until much later was the extent to which Hopkins had mobilized his own resources to help. The woodworking classes that suddenly became available with a scholarship that covered tuition and materials. The referral to a construction company that specialized in hiring workers with disabilities and offered modified duties that accommodated back injuries. The contact information for a counselor who worked on a sliding fee scale and had experience with men navigating divorce and custody issues. Hopkins never presented these opportunities as charity from him personally. Instead, they appeared as lucky breaks, helpful strangers, doors that opened at just the right moment. David began to rebuild his life one small step at a time, but he always credited that Christmas Eve phone call as the moment when someone showed him he was worth saving. 6 months later, David had steady work with the construction company, had moved into his own apartment, and had gradually increased his visits with his daughter. His ex-wife, seeing real changes rather than just promises, had begun to soften her stance about custody. Most importantly, David had stopped thinking about disappearing and started thinking about building something. Hopkins continued to call periodically, checking in, celebrating David's progress, offering encouragement during setbacks. But he also began to share more of his own story. The years lost to drinking, the relationships damaged by his inability to be present, the long journey of making amends and learning to trust himself again. "You saved my life that night," David told Hopkins during one of their calls. "No," Hopkins replied. "You saved your own life. You just needed someone to remind you that it was worth saving." The story of that Christmas Eve call never became public knowledge during Hopkins' lifetime. Neither man spoke about it to the media or used it for publicity. David occasionally told the story to men in similar situations, other fathers struggling with divorce, other workers displaced by injury, other people who'd found themselves at the end of their rope. Hopkins continued his quiet charitable work, often helping individuals rather than making large public donations, always maintaining the privacy of the people he assisted. Years later, when David had become a successful furniture maker specializing in custom pieces for families in his community, he would tell his teenage daughter about the night a stranger's kindness had changed everything. Not about who the stranger was, that remained private, but about the power of one person choosing to care when caring wasn't required. "The most important thing your grandfather taught me," David would tell his daughter, "is that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply believing they matter. One person believing in you can be enough to help you believe in yourself again." This story reminds us that heroism often happens in private moments, in conversations no one else will ever hear, in choices to extend compassion when it would be easier to hang up the phone. Anthony Hopkins, already secure in his legacy as one of the greatest actors of his generation, chose to spend Christmas Eve listening to a stranger's pain, and then spent months helping that stranger rebuild his life. In a world that often feels divided and disconnected, the story of Anthony Hopkins and David Martinez shows us that profound healing can happen through simple human connection. It reminds us that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stay on the line when someone needs to be heard. If this hidden chapter of Anthony Hopkins's life moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their life matters, that help exists even in dark moments, and that one conversation can change everything. Have you ever experienced a moment when a stranger's kindness pulled you back from the edge? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing stories about the moments that reveal the best of human nature.